What does it take to make workshops work? And how can we facilitate collaboration that sticks and leads to results? My name is Miriam Hatness, and with the Workshops Work podcast, I'm on the mission to find the magic ingredients that make workshops work. Today with me on the show is Blair, a returning guest, and we speak about presence of a facilitator and all the different nuances. So stay tuned. And by the way, if you don't have pen and paper at hand to take your own notes, scroll down to the show notes and download my free one-page summary. Now, lean back to be inspired. Hello, Sean. Welcome back.
So nice to be back.
Yes. And I'm curious to have a conversation with you that is not about Lego serious play.
Yeah, me too.
Let's see where we're going. And we thought of a few topics to explore today. And one of them was presence and curiosity, and whether or not we could teach these skills that are, on the one hand, so important for facilitation and still so intangible somehow, at least the presence part.
Yeah, it is a great question. How does a facilitator be self-aware enough of their own presence? How do we know what impact we're having on a group? How do we know when to dial that kind of directive energy up and dial the back of the classroom energy up and disappear? And how do you teach it? I mean, I don't think I know an answer to that question. How do you teach presence?
And I wonder, actually, listening to you, I wonder whether presence is a really skill or rather a mindset or a state of being. Well, it definitely is a state of being. And I wondered how much self-awareness we need to actually catch ourselves whether we are present or not. Because there are these situations where the mind wanders off and it's only a minute later or so that we realize, oh, I haven't been present.
And there's a difference between being present, the act of showing up, and presence, how people experience us. I mean, I think there might be a slight difference between those two, being present and presence.
Where the presence is the way to hold space without being dominant?
Yeah, let's start by trying to define what presence is from a facilitation perspective. I guess presence is a combination of how we show up, how high or low our energy is, or our directiveness. I mean, from a facilitator perspective, what I find myself saying in training sometimes is, if you're facilitating a group of 500 people and you're trying to get them back after lunch, quite a good idea to have a big presence. Time for big energy, big directiveness. If you're trying to start at 2:00 and you give the room permission to not start at 2:00, which, I mean, you could argue debate the point, but I would sort of say that that's a moment where a bit of big presence, big directiveness can help you start on time. For instance, if starting on time is important.
What makes big presence? Because somehow I thought of dominance or being loud.
Yep.
And there are parts of me that doubt that one has to be dominant, loud, or extroverted to have big presence. I would say that the Dalai Lama has big presence.
Yes, so maybe there's a distinction we need to make here. I mean, the Dalai Lama or Gandhi or some of these huge figures from history, not loud or domineering, but huge presence. So maybe big presence is the wrong turn of phrase. So yeah, another interesting point. I mean, I guess if the Dalai Lama was trying to get 500 people to sit down and be ready to start at 2:00, would he do it in an energetic, meditative, or is there a moment where it's actually a good thing to clang a bell and ask for everyone's attention? I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? I mean, if you've got 500 people coming back after lunch, a lot of people aren't aware of the time. A lot of people are so involved in the wonderful conversation with their sort of neighbor or partner, somebody they haven't seen for years, their attention is not on starting on time.
And maybe that's exactly where it lands. So if instead of trying to be loud and dominant and telling the 500 participants what to do, what if it was our content that would actually draw them back in? Because I would think that if the group knows that the Dalai Lama is about to speak, everyone will show up on time. If everyone who's really interested in would stand on stage and just be silent, I think everyone very quickly would also get silent and focus. Something that I often think in workshops is, instead of asking participants to turn their phones off and to do all these things, what can we do in order to attract their curiosity and focus? Because I believe that once you start with a Lego session and you get the participants involved and use their hands, they don't even think of using their phones instead.
Sure. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting question, isn't it? So let's sort of run the hypothesis. There's a workshop, there's 500 people, it's 1:58. We're supposed to start at 2:00. We're working in a culture where timekeeping matters, and some cultures it matters less. Do you start that session with something so interesting and so appealing, and you framed it before lunch so that everyone knows that they simply come back and are obedient and are ready to go at 2? I think my experience of humans is I've just recently done the Insights accreditation, so I've started using the Insights profiling tool.
Which is a personality profiling tool.
Exactly. So Insights is one of those 4-color, 4-quadrant profiling tools. And the 4 archetypes are fiery red, people who are sort of a bit directive; cool blue, people who are sort of very process oriented; earth green, very values driven; and sunshine yellow. Sunshine yellow tend to be, you could characterize them as being very chatty. And actually, what's interesting about people who lead with the sort of sunshine yellow energy is they're the people who are just chatting. And they're even if it's the Dalai Lama about to do something amazing with Lego, 2:00, they're still so interested in the chatty conversation they're having, they're not ready to go. I think some people live so in the moment and are so interested in the present moment. And you know, the Dalai Lama is an interesting construct in this conversation, because the Dalai Lama doesn't show up at most 500 people conferences, unfortunately. So, you know, in a sort of more traditional setting with a more traditional facilitator, how does that facilitator get the attention of a group to be ready to go? Do they need a commanding presence or a loud voice or a domineering personality or a big bell? So I think that's why I mentioned that as an example of a time in the process to try to have a commanding directive energy, just as there are other times when a very small or invisible presence, if the group is doing the work, if the conversation that they wanted to have is happening, and you as a podcast, you know, interviewer, host, here you are being quiet and still and watching me as I grapple with the thoughts in my mind and spew forth. So your presence in this moment is supportive, but soft. And if I started to talk about politics or the football results or something where we go very off the idea of workshops work, you might gently intervene to bring me back, and then I still talk about Arsenal, you know, the match last night or whatever. And I just keep, you know, eventually you might be a bit more directive.
That's a good point. And I wonder whether it might be helpful to think back of what is actually the purpose of the facilitator. So what's our role? And if our role is to be in service of the group, or as a podcast host in service of the guest, then how do we have to show our presence so that we can best fulfill that role? Because sometimes maybe under some circumstances, it might actually be okay to give the group more slack.
Yeah.
Before returning from a session, because very often there are these liminal moments around the coffee machine, the breaks, that are actually most valuable for the participants. And then it's not about us and our content that we want to share. No, it's about them and building connections and speaking about the content afterwards. Whereas in other moments, maybe it's very important to come back in time and to continue.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So how do you help, if you were to be my teacher and you were to help me learn about when to exercise that judgment or not, how could you teach me about that?
You mean teaching about how dominant to be or how directive to be as a facilitator?
If you could teach me about, let's assume that I understand that there is, let's just use the words big and small for now as a shorthand. Big presence, small presence, or visible or invisible. So we know that this exists. And I sort of say to you, well, look, Miriam, I know that there is this thing of big presence and small presence, but how do I know when to choose which state? How do I decide? What are the things that I need to know in order to decide the volume from 1 to 10?
Interesting question. I would think of what the purpose of the session. So I would think in a training session, we are facilitative trainers, and then facilitation happens from the front of the room. So more presence, big presence is needed, and more direction.
So one thing in order to help me know how to operate my dial is I have to know about purpose, and I need to know the purpose of the event.
Yeah.
And even the purpose of the given moment. So that's purpose at a couple of levels. What else do I need to know? So let's assume I understand the purpose of the event and I understand the purpose in the moment.
The participants.
Yeah.
So who are they? Are they a bunch of students who might not be able to judge for themselves the value of the session?
Okay.
Whereas adults or even leaders are more likely to be able to judge for themselves. Okay.
So I need to know something about the participants and have an assessment about their valuing of the event or the mode.
Also, and the context. So if it's a team event or corporate, if I'm hosting a session for a client, and then I think there's a different judgment for how much time the group needs in the moments in between, as opposed to a air quotes public event where everyone purchased a pass or a ticket to join. Because then it's basically the responsibility of the person. It would be my responsibility to deliver the value that all participants expect. So this would be context.
Participants and context.
Part of context is also culture.
The culture of the group.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And then my role, did we have that already? So as in what role am I invited to the session?
Yeah, the expectations of my role.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's already quite a lot. In order that I understand how to deploy my visible or invisible, big or small presence, I need to know about the purpose, the overarching purpose, and the purpose in the moment. I need to know something of the participants and their expectations. I have to understand the context. I need to know something about the culture of the country, the organization, the people in the room, and the expectations on my role. Gosh, that's quite a lot, isn't it?
What do you think?
I agree with that list. I'm just trying to think about, are there any other? I guess it's related to purpose, some form of ongoing evaluation or assessment about, this is related to purpose, I think. Are we meeting the stated needs that we set out for, or even meeting some unstated needs that we didn't set out for, but are as valuable as the stated ones, or even more valuable than the stated ones? I mean, that thing about facilitate the people, not the process.
Yes.
So we design a process, we set out with the process in mind, and then a thing happens, and the facilitator needs to be able to make an evaluation about, is the thing that just happened worth delving into and unpacking, or do we kick that into the long grass? And
so what we do need to know is the process. Yes. So what is actually the plan of the day? How much time do we have?
And so the process, and also an evaluation of the usefulness of the present moment. That, it's interesting. As I tell that story, it reminds me of, you did a podcast with Sandy Wilson, one of my clients. And I was just remembering, I went up to Scotland the very first time I met him and the leadership team. And I was facilitating a short session, partly to introduce them to some of the methods that we might have been using, partly for them to assess whether I was a good fit for them. And we had this really awkward moment where the chief executive, who's a delightful lady called Fiona Logan, who leads with Sunshine Yellow Energy, asked a question that was very tangential. And she began to open up a completely different pathway to the purpose of the event. And I sort of sat there for a moment and thought, oh no, what do I do here? Because I wanted to say to her, Fiona, that's not what we're going to talk about today. But she's the chief exec and I haven't been hired yet. And I thought about it. So that was a moment of choice about presence. And I stepped in and I said, Fiona, really interesting. I don't remember exactly what I said, but I basically closed her down. And she went, ooh. It's like no one ever closes her down. You just don't do that. And I have to say, in that moment, my heart slightly sank and I thought, oh gosh,
did I lose the gig?
Yeah.
Yeah.
She might have thought I'm arrogant and overbearing and
disrespectful.
I thought about it afterwards, and I haven't actually asked Sandy about this, but I thought about it afterwards, and I thought, actually, that was a really good moment, because in that moment, I demonstrated the confidence to be able to intervene and say, actually, that's not what we need to be talking about now. We're going to go somewhere else. And yes, she was slightly shocked, but my purpose in intervening wasn't to show my presence, but I think an unintended consequence was it gave the client some reassurance that the person that they were about to hire would keep the group on track.
Yeah. Yeah. I think it's a wonderful example. Also, for another facilitation superpower besides presence is courage. And I think the reason why leaders might hire facilitators for their processes and even their meetings is because they want to participate and because they are aware that they're just humans who sometimes go on tangents. And then it's the role of a facilitator to actually keep everyone on track. And in order to have that presence in present of powerful people, we do need courage. And then I think it's beautiful what you just said, that you did that not to signal or show presence, but you used your presence for a higher purpose. And I think that's the entire thing about presence. It's not about presence, about showing off or being someone. It's to remain there for the group and to help them achieve whatever goal they hired you to achieve.
Yes, that kind of more ego-driven presence is sort of putting your own needs ahead of the group's needs. Hey, group, recognize me. Aren't I cool?
Which brings to my mind is, and coming back to the question you asked me about how to teach that.
Yes.
And I think this moment of how do you interrupt someone in a polite way without coming across as arrogant, disrespectful. So to signal and show presence, but also confidence.
Yeah.
And competence, actually. Yeah. And I think it's a very thin line. So how do you teach that?
I tell you where my mind was going. I was looking at the list that I'm making. I'm writing down these things that we're identifying. And I've definitely in the classroom seen the people that we've been training make the wrong choice about presence if they're too focused on the process.
Yeah.
So they're learning a new thing. So they have a process guide. The group is doing something and there's a moment of choice as to step in, not step in. And they haven't been paying attention to what's been going on. And they've just very awkwardly changed gear and the group go, and then they go somewhere else. So the process I've definitely seen process failure or using process too strongly to alter presence. Purpose for sure, absolutely. I mean, that's that moment of knowing when to keep a conversation on purpose or to bring back a drifting conversation that's off purpose back towards purpose. So I'm sort of almost trying to do a little test. How could we teach people? I mean, this is such an interesting topic.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should try to codify this conversation into a sort of a blog article or a how-to sheet, because I could really see myself using these ideas of purpose and participation and context and culture to have a conversation with the people that we teach.
I think these are the big building blocks of what makes a good facilitator. And I think I must say that I'm slightly frustrated when I look at the curricula of many facilitation trainings that focus on process, on activities, on methods, on the doing, and totally neglect any of the items that we have just mentioned.
Yes, it's kind of the doing-being gap, isn't it? I mean,
and facilitation is not about the doing. I think if you have the presence, if you know the purpose, if you understand the context, then all the doing will fall into place, and you will learn it. You will wing it.
Actually, I love that idea that facilitation is not about doing. Maybe that could even be the title of this podcast. I don't know. But there is some doing that needs to be done. And facilitation is also just not about the being. I mean, the Dalai Lama kind of story that we were telling earlier, there is definitely a place for being and learning about being. And I agree that I think a lot of facilitation teaching and even some facilitators think it is about the doing and the activities. And
it's the easy bit.
It's
easy to teach.
It is the easy bit to teach. And I'm thinking about a piece of feedback I got when I was in my mid-30s. I facilitated a 2-day conference for about 120 head teachers. I mean, this was such a big moment for me. This learning moment was, one of my clients was this lovely guy called David Jackson, who was my elder by quite some margin. And at the end of the 2-day conference, he very gently sort of said to me, he said, "Sean, I wonder whether you should think more about facilitating the people, not the process." So that was all he said. I mean, implicit in that, the meaning I made of that was I had been too focused on the activities and the process and the doing. And in my mid-30s, not aware enough on the facilitating the people. I mean, that's become one of the mantras in our training: facilitate the people, not the process. But in order to be able to facilitate the people whilst also holding a pre-prepared process in one hand is something around self-awareness, the skill of knowing when to intervene, when to not intervene, when to be big, when to be small.
Yeah, and managing ourselves. Because the moment where I have the urge to intervene, the first question that I have to ask myself is, am I intervening for myself or for the group or for the process or for the goal?
I don't think anyone's ever going to ask that question. I mean, I love the hypothetical of it, but in a moment where Fiona Logan suddenly goes, "Wee!" I think the ability to ask for the facilitator to ask the question, am I about to say what I'm about to say for me or for the group or the purpose? Did you ever watch the first Top Gun movie?
Oh, very long time ago. Is it with Tom Cruise?
Yeah, Tom Cruise. So I think in the very first Top Gun movie, Tom Cruise is this kind of hotshot pilot. And it was her name Kelly McGillis. I can't remember. This is the woman who he'd fallen in love with. She was the teacher. And she was grilling him about one particular maneuver he might make whilst at Mach 4 in his super jet. And he just sort of said, "You just know. You don't have time to think. You just know." I mean, that's an analogy, but I have some sympathy with that in a facilitation environment. I guess that knowing is just built on experience and doing some things right and some things wrong.
Yes, and I think until we have built this intuition to the ability to just pause and ask the question, because we don't interrupt immediately. It's not that because someone goes on a tangent slightly, it's not that they jump there and then we jump in and stop them. Is first we listen a bit and then we wonder, where they're going. And then we realize, this is not the touching point of a tangent, but they're going into a different sphere. And then we interrupt.
I mean, I love the word interruption, which sort of gives another lens through which to look at this. Have you ever sort of seen a facilitator sort of say to the group, so any questions then? No, great, let's move on.
Yes.
Yeah. So they're asking any questions. They give absolutely no time for a response, and then they move on to the next thing. There's something about the interruption versus the holding space. Within that sort of moment is something about presence. So any questions, and just being perfectly okay for that space to be there versus the literal cut across interruption. Actually, John, do you mind if I stop you there? We're just not going to deal with that today.
Yeah. And both need a lot of confidence. The holding space and being silent needs as much confidence, I think, as... Yeah. Oh, Paul, would you mind me stopping you there?
Yeah, that's sort of the confidence to hold a space. I mean, I've seen it many, many times in our classrooms where the trainee facilitator asks a question and doesn't give the group enough time to answer. And I think you're right. It does take confidence to sit in a moment of openness and not knowing.
And funny enough, I think it is confidence, but it's kind of a false confidence because what it actually does is signaling trust to the group and thereby creating what we would call psychological safety. Mm-hmm. So that because by me pausing and waiting for the group to answer, trusting that there is for sure something that will emerge, also gives them the space to feel safe enough. Okay, I may speak. I have permission to speak.
Yes, or even the confidence that if something doesn't emerge, that's okay too. There's another sort of component of trust, actually. You must have interviewed Ib Raven.
Yes, he was on the podcast just 2 or 3 weeks ago.
I went to a conference where he spoke some years ago, and he talked about self-determination theory. I haven't listened to
We spoke about that on the podcast.
Brilliant. Autonomy, competence, and relatedness.
Yes.
I've been using his ideas for years. He's a lovely and clever chap and a wise facilitator. You know, I don't want to repeat his idea, but there's something about trust. I mean, in terms of the relatedness piece, I know an idea that I use a lot since hearing his lecture, his input, his workshop. At a large conference, I tend to be by the front door. And as people are arriving, I tend to sort of say, welcome, come on in, put your coat over there, grab a coffee, maybe go and find someone you don't know. And what's so interesting about that idea is it creates a sense of relatedness. Mm-hmm. They don't know who I am. But before I've even got to the front of the room and ding the bell at 9 o'clock, if that's the way we start, people know that, oh, that's that bloke, met me at the door, warmly welcomed me. And that creates a sense of relatedness and a sense of trust. So even before the very first thing has been said, there is a degree of relatedness and I think therefore trust.
Yeah. I think it starts even before that with the invitation.
Agreed.
How do you invite people? And I like to send a short video to participants before they join.
Oh, right.
So they get a sense of who I am, my energy. And when they then step in,
what a lovely idea.
They've seen my face already.
What a lovely idea. Relatedness. It's funny because I have said to many clients over the years, hey, when you've got the email or the invitation drafted, send it over. I'd love to have a look. It's not really part of my brief. It's not really part of my job, but It's funny, I do find myself drawn to wanting to take a look.
I write it for them.
Yeah, I have written, I have edited, but I wonder whether that's sort of common practice.
Good question. I don't know. I don't trust the clients to write the invitation in a way and form that I want to bring the spirit that we're about to create across. And I think they cannot, because they don't know.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think by the way we invited, I don't remember the book. It was a book about how to invite to dinner parties, the most extravagant invitations to dinner parties. And it referred to one, it was in the time before email. And they would send out the invitations at different times of the day. But was it that far earlier than email? Anyway, so what they said in the invitation was, come dressed with the same clothes that you wore when you were opening this invitation.
Oh, really?
And what it created, so the invitation as such created an atmosphere already, what to expect at the dinner party. So obviously you had some who came in a pajama and others in very extravagant dresses. And I wonder whether we can, maybe not to that extreme, but whether we can replicate it with our invitations to workshops. And especially when we struggle with people coming late or coming in, going out, not taking it seriously. To what extent can we bring it across that it's important for them to be present, not only physically?
Yeah. I ran a workshop last week for a well-known digital company. It was interesting. Maybe 15 people showed up. I think it's about 15. It was an online meeting. We used Lego Serious Play throughout. And the body language at the beginning was so interesting.
Leaning back with crossed arms and no smile.
Yeah, kind of my interpretation for some of the body language I saw was, what the hell are we doing at this? You know, I'm a busy person. 2.5 hours, Lego, really? There must have been some version of that going through some of the heads.
How did you react?
How did I react? I guess I just noticed that that's what we were working with. I guess what I did and what I often do, but I probably did it a bit more forcefully, was the chief exec or senior guy did his thing, set the scene, talked about the importance of the meeting. And then we went into the workshop. And the first thing we always do in a Lego Serious Play workshop, as you know, is the skills build. We get people to do some technical skills. How do the bricks connect? And then we get bricks as metaphors. And so somebody had built a model. And I sort of said, okay, Fred, I'd rebuilt it. It was an online session. And I said, Fred, you stay quiet. Jane, can you just talk us through what Fred's model was?
And you're holding the pen into the camera then?
The camera, yeah. And of course, Jane couldn't remember because she wasn't listening. So what I did was I facilitated the listening test really with strong presence. Quite
I was about to say that.
Yeah. And I made sure that the level of attention went from 15% to 100%. And then at the end of that exercise, we were 15 minutes into the workshop. I sort of said to people, so is anybody experiencing any differences mediating this conversation using Lego bricks? It's like, yeah, we're really paying attention to each other. We're really listening to each other. Oh, that's interesting. What's that like? Yeah, it's good. And it was so interesting at the end of the workshop, from having a lot of this.
Leaning back with crossed arms. I'm just speaking out because some of the audience might not watch the YouTube video.
No, thank you for doing that. I'd forgotten. I sort of said of the co-facilitator was one of our graduates, and I'd given her a bit of coaching to run the session. And I said to the participants, I said, I'd just really like to take a moment to appreciate the work that your colleague has done in designing and running this session. You know, how was it? And they said, oh, it's fantastic. Could we use this? Are you available to come along and facilitate with us? So it was so lovely to see that shift from cross-armed reticence, oh my God, it's going to be a 2-hour meeting in the middle of my busy day, to actually, we've had a fantastic workshop. We've talked about some of the key skills and competencies our team will need in the year ahead. We've clarified what the top ones of those are. We've built some shared views about what a successful team in the future will look like. And we've actually listened to each other in a creative way. It's been a wonderful use of 2 and a bit hours, however long it was. So that was it's a nice story to share. And I guess the relatedness of that point to presence was, in my case, I was pretty directive, pretty strong presence at the beginning to facilitate them to listen to each other more strongly.
Yeah. What's interesting about that example is that it was very provocative and very strong presence, almost teacher-like presence. You put someone on the spot and clarified that they were not listening.
Knowing they wouldn't be able to answer the question.
Yeah. Which in some cultures, and this comes back to our very first part of the conversation, knowing the culture. So I think in Japan, for instance, I assume that you wouldn't have done that, or it wouldn't have been appreciated. Or maybe it would, given that you're an outsider to that culture. Which then
I think that cultural dimension, and your example of doing that in Japan, I think that would be a massive faux pas.
Yes.
To put a senior leader on the spot who you knew wasn't listening and make them look foolish. That would be rude.
Yeah. And still, in your context, it was helpful. And it was the shift. It was the wake-up call for the group. Okay, what's happening here? Why are we wasting our time? And this could actually be useful. It also depends how you're framing this learning moment. Because you can put someone on the spot and just be like, okay, you're not listening. Now pay attention.
Yeah, you're wrong.
You're wrong. And then maybe that's an ego thing, and maybe that's also an insecurity thing. So if as a facilitator you're less confident, then you're putting them on the spot, and then it will come across as rude. Whereas I can imagine when you're doing this with your British politeness and your confidence, it's a poke. A gentle poke.
Yeah, and it's a gentle poke in service of the group.
Yes.
It's not in service of me to try to make me look clever. And in the reflections, I don't think that exercise was explicitly framed as being an exercise in listening. The exercise was framed as learning to use the bricks as metaphors. But in the reflection, and put as a question, not as an assertion, well, how did you find that? Well, found that we were listening to each other a bit better. Oh, yeah. And what was that? What was that like? No, it was good. Rather than, did you notice that when I put you on the spot, you were listening better?
It would be a different lesson for the group. Oh, why don't you put your team members on the spot more?
Yeah, exactly. It's
the wrong message.
Kind of inquiry as opposed to advocacy.
Yeah. Can you teach that?
To some extent. I think the answer is, so in our classroom, our students will observe me doing that to them. And some of them will pick up upon that incredibly quickly and make it part of their own practice because they've seen the value in it. So it's definitely teachable. It's interesting, in our last podcast, quite near the beginning, I sort of said to you, you learn to facilitate by facilitating. And you went, ooh, can't you also learn to facilitate by watching? Do you remember? You may not remember. Mm-hmm. I remember. And it's interesting because the first time around I was advocating learning through doing. And this time in this story, I'm illustrating learning through observation. That's teaching a technique in a way. So the question is, can you teach the understanding of the technique, the principles underpinning it? I guess that's why if we were to distill this conversation into a one-pager, here are sort of 10 ideas that facilitator presence may be built on. maybe you can teach techniques and also understanding.
Yeah. And then I think you still have to draw the attention, because we all absorb different things and we remember different content as we listen to the same input.
Yep.
And then if we really want a group to pick up or to learn something from us modeling it, I think we really have to draw their attention to it and then maybe let them try it out. And I remember I was in a workshop.
Yeah.
And by that time, I found it highly uncomfortable. And I think they didn't do a good job in providing safe space. But what was remarkable was there were short sequences of role play where, as participants, where they put us in a scene, someone went outside not knowing the context, and they had to come in and to investigate to find out what the scene was about. So it was a little bit of improv theater. So for instance, someone would go outside and not know that they were the father, finding out that their daughter was dating their best friend, who's 30 years older, example. And then what we had to do is the person came back in and started the conversation, basically trying to find out what's really going on. And we had a how do you call these things? Like in the taboo game, which makes bop, a buzzer. We had a buzzer to indicate each time that we felt uncomfortable as a participant in this situation.
Oh, right.
And I found that exercise so remarkable because it helped us understand the nuances of discomfort. So we feel uncomfortable as soon as someone is trying to talk around the topic, someone who is pretending, someone who's not authentic, someone is too harsh or not harsh enough. And it was a really good exercise, actually.
Yeah, that's the word nuances, I think, is a lovely word in this context, because the nuances kind of matter. Those small signs. I mean, I guess that's another really interesting thing about discomfort in a facilitation exercise. You know, you're facilitating a group, somebody gets really upset and they start crying. So clearly in the room, there is some discomfort. Somebody's upset. What's interesting is the facilitator, their own comfort or discomfort with that, and then how they read the room's comfort or discomfort with that. In my case, now I'm in my 50s. If somebody is tearful in one of my sessions, it's always welcome. Tears never not welcome, because tears are an authentic emotion. So it's an authentic voice. Great. Maybe there's something important to be said. Maybe there's not. For me, I think in my mid-30s, if somebody was tearful in one of my workshops, my own discomfort would, oh my God, they're crying. Now what? No, don't cry. It's okay. So again, it's just sort of interesting about how the facilitators' own presence, own securities or insecurities, how those show up. I mean, I've seen this so many times in our trainings when a trainee facilitator is trying to get a group to an agreement. And they might say to the group, okay, so just run through this one final last time. One final last time. Well, that suggests that the story is finished. It's over. That's the facilitator expressing a judgment or asking a question. So are we all in agreement then? Thumbs up if we are. It's like, that is not a clean process.
That can be very manipulative.
Because, absolutely. I mean, a better question would be, what's your level of agreement to this?
Yeah.
My level of agreement, show me some fingers. I've got 4s, 5s, and a couple of 1s. So the level of agreement is about 4.5, 3.5. So either we'll carry on until we get a high level of agreement, or actually 4.5 is the furthest we can go today. But that's very different to, so are we on an agreement then? Show me some thumbs.
So where would you go? How would you react if you see lots of 1s or a few 2s and you're running out of time?
I've been there. I've experienced exactly that. I was running a 2-day workshop in Germany for a software engineering company. The idea was on day one, we would look at their vision and their purpose. And the idea was on day two, we'd look at their strategy. At the end of day one, they were at 2. And in my lexicon, a strategy is in service of a vision and a purpose. So if our vision and purpose is only 2 out of 5, how can we possibly develop the strategy? We don't know what we're in service of yet. So we threw the plan out of the window, and on day 2, we carried on with the vision and the purpose. Facilitate the people, not the process. So we didn't do what we'd planned for day 2, did a different thing.
Yeah.
And there were also some other very interesting reasons about why we only got to 2 out of 5 at the end of day 1. There were all sorts of other things that affected that, which were sort of valuable learnings.
Would you feel open to share?
Yeah. So I think my kind of take on why we got such a low score at the end of day 1, it was one of those situations where I had been contracted in through a third party. So I hadn't really done the contracting and the prep. So I was too distant from the client. The workshop had grown from a maximum of 12 people to all of a sudden with 17. So, wow, big change. I mean, 12 is already quite a lot for a vision and purpose, but 17 is somewhat bigger. Some of the people had shown up very much with their own agenda. One participant, I learned later, had asked whether he could take an hour and a half slot to present his pet project and was told no, he couldn't. And he was annoyed. And therefore, his sort of annoyance showed as a disruptive force. I think another part of that, and no disrespect to the client, the chief executive of that group was very weak. He lacked the confidence to step in. We had a kind of a coaching conversation with him at the end. You know, there's been some behavior in the room today that's really not on. Of all of the voices in the room, you are the one to sort of say that's not okay to behave that way. You have to step in if you see that. It's like, okay. And then morning of day 2, there it was again. So I sort of think those were some of the conditions that created that. It's interesting. Sometimes in our trainings, people say to me, hey, Sean, tell me about a workshop that hasn't worked. And I haven't got very many. Most of them do work. That's probably my best example of where a number of things didn't quite work. So that's a story I sort of return to quite often. And I think that the learning points around that are, you know, if you don't trust your clients to write the invites, then if you're through a third party, you can be just too distant. So my antenna go up when I'm being contracted through a third party. I don't like it. You know, occasionally a sort of an events company or a management consultancy or an advertising agency sort of say, hey, Sean, we've got this client, would love you to run this thing for us. And I always say myself, okay, this is going to be far more complicated in terms of prep.
Yeah.
So that's because a lot can go wrong in that. I think failures of workshop is probably always down to failure to prep, not doing the prep properly.
Yeah. And also the increase of participants. I mean, so many of the things you have listed that led to this air quotes failure. So classical. Oh, we have a strategy workshop and then, let's invite more people just to avoid the conflict. And then you have people in there who are not supposed to be in there. And there's a good reason they're not supposed to be in there. So they want to make themselves heard. They want to make sure that they have at least their own understanding of being there. So they most of the time become disruptors, right?
That's exactly what happened in this one. 2 or 3 quite culturally, there was a wonderfully disruptive, I don't want to caricature any particular nation, but there's one very sort of French man, very sort of vociferous and strong personality. And, you know, he was a very disruptive force on that session throughout the whole 2 days.
Yeah. And I remember I was designing a workshop with a client and was told that, yes, there's this one participant and they prepared a 1.5 hours input that they would like to present.
Yeah.
And my answer was no, impossible. But then scheduled a call with these people to see, okay, how can we, is it really necessary? How can we either deliver that before the workshop or boil it down to 10 minutes? Basically also making them understand it was online, that nobody will even listen for that time. So it's not in their interest to do that, but to just call someone off and say, no, you don't have space to do that, will then lead to the situation that you just described. So they are frustrated and they will vent their frustration in the session. So it's even more preparation then to get the fire extinguished before the session.
Gosh, isn't it funny? We've had such similar experiences. There must be some universal truths in that sort of set of experiences.
I think it's very corporate. It's very corporate.
Yeah, I think my radar, my spider senses always go up when I get an inquiry through a third party. It makes it much more complicated.
Never done that.
Well, if it ever happens, make at least a 50% increase of budget
Yes.
for the prep phase.
Yes. This in general is a good thing when working with corporates of any sort. What remains your biggest facilitation challenge?
At the moment, my biggest facilitation challenge.
Or related to presence?
Gosh, let me try and answer your question. My biggest facilitation challenge related to my own presence at the moment. I mean, the one that pops into my mind is I've recently added the Insights Discovery personality tool to my toolkit. And I felt like a novice again. I don't think it was so much related to presence. In the moment, on the day itself, I know most of my content so well that I have the confidence to deploy it professionally well. When I'm a beginner again with some methods that I know less well, I become that unconfident person again, not knowing when to intervene or when to not intervene. So it's been interesting. Recently, I have gone back to my 30s again, sort of metaphorically speaking, of being a beginner again. So a beginner with a new instrument. And I think on the day, my attention might have been more drawn towards my process notes than the people. So, this is kind of a nice sense check in some of the things that we've said so far. But where my mind went when you first asked the question, because you were first asked the question, what's my biggest challenge? And then you added with presence. And you asked, what's my biggest challenge? My answer was different. And that was, right now I'm working on a new sort of facilitation framework to try to help organizations with digital transformation. I think we are about to experience a massive acceleration in terms of organizational change as a result of AI, cloud computing, infinitely scalable computing, Internet of Things, 5G technology making mobile even broader and more available, and to be massively accelerated in the quite foreseeable future with quantum computing. I think that raft of technologies coming together is likely to create a wave of change that makes the last 40 years of digital transformation look like the warm-up act. So I think that's going to be quite an interesting challenge.
I do understand that it's an organizational challenge.
And I'm currently working with, I think it's much bigger than just organizational.
So you mentioned as a challenge the big digital transformation coming to organizations. And I understand that this is an organizational challenge. Where do you see the particular facilitation challenge for you there?
That's a great question. I guess as a designer of frameworks and processes, the challenge I'm currently working on is trying to design a process to guide an organization through making sense of these changes that are coming along. So the challenge for me as a facilitator is a framework design challenge if you were asked to lead an organization on a journey to answer the question, what will be the impact of digital transformation on us? What are the steps that we would go through to help an organization survive and even thrive in the face of this great confluence of hugely disruptive technologies?
What just crossed my mind is that we spoke for over 1 hour of presence and facilitation, and presence being more important than process. And here we come speaking about the biggest challenge being actually the process.
I think the challenge feels like a process challenge at the moment, because that's the place, that journey I currently am. People are key to digital transformation. The technology is not it. It's called the technology fallacy. So people are the key to digital transformation. And actually, in this hugely disruptive sphere, probably the human-to-human connection becomes even more important. The human at the center of the system, and humans doing what humans can uniquely do, becomes even more important. So the people become way more important than the process. But I think at this stage of my journey, it is a process challenge. What is the process by which you lead an organization on a course of 6 months to form themselves in a way that they can survive and thrive?
And I think in this, given what you just said about the importance of people and organizations that tend to neglect that fact, so they just want to go fast. So how to help an organization to actually slow down and to recognize that it's the people that matter, and maybe even bringing in some facilitation skills to the people. Because I think in order to survive such a fast pace of transformation, we have to adjust our communication, because we cannot.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Otherwise, everything goes down a rabbit hole of miscommunication, overwhelm, and burnout. So learning to listen, learning to slow down, learning to have more effective meetings, I think becomes even more important when we speak about digital transformation. Learning how to collaborate with AI.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, marker for a future conversation in 3 or 4 or 6 or 12 months' time. Be lovely to revisit this topic. I mean, I know that Workshops Work interviewed an AI. I listened to that podcast, actually. It was such an interesting experiment. And it sort of does pull into question the idea that the humans do uniquely what humans can do. The algorithmic things that machines and computers do so well, it kind of requires us as facilitators, I think, to have a clearer understanding about how to facilitate the kinds of things that only humans can do, such as make amazing and unusual new connections, new affordances together, ways that have been previously unimagined, work with a set of ethics, our understanding of what ethics means. So there's a new set of awarenesses a facilitator might need if they find themselves in the middle of this huge breaking wave of technological change.
Yeah. And I think there's something we can really learn from communicating with AI, because I realized that working more and more with ChatGPT, I am more patient and more forgiving when it doesn't understand what I mean. So I would put a prompt and then get an outcome or response where I'm like, this doesn't make sense. That's not what I asked. But instead of getting frustrated, I know that I have to be more precise. Whereas when I'm in communication with a human being, I somehow expect that they can read my mind and understand what I mean without being precise enough.
Yeah. I love that. That's a wonderful the AI is my teacher of patience.
Yes. And of precision in the ask.
You know, that the precision really speaks to me. I mean, I try to be a precise communicator, and I find myself getting frustrated with imprecise communication. So yeah, that really sort of speaks to my personality type.
Mm. And before we close, I want to come back to something that you said earlier about your other challenge. And I think it's beautiful to add a new tool to your toolbox as a facilitator, and having such you are renowned for Lego serious play, and then still adding something new that could be a nice complement. I think that's amazing. And you said that you're now metaphorically back in your mid-30s. And I think that it's something that holds many facilitators back in continuing to learn, that it is daring and it asks for courage. So where do you then practice? So where's the space for learning, failing, and testing for you when you learn a new tool?
That's a lovely framing, generous framing, and a good question. I found, and this is kind of all credit to the Insights community, I went to a meeting of other Insights facilitators, and I spoke in front of, 50, 60 people, and sort of said, I'm new here, I'm unconfident, and what I'm really hoping I'll get from today is one or two people willing to put me under their wing. And what was so lovely was how the community responded to that. In particular, one lady called Lindy was just so generous with her time. She invited me to come and observe her facilitating an online session. She invited me to come and work with her partner in facilitating a face-to-face session. In fact, funnily enough, one of their company values is what she calls confident humility. And what she said to me,
that's beautiful.
She said afterwards that she saw me operating with confident humility in standing up and sort of saying, I'm willing to, carry people's bags and do the washing up if people would help me. So that's sort of what happened. And she wasn't the only one. There was a lovely guy called Johnny who helped me out, and another lady who's one of our graduates helped me out. So I found an enormous amount of support from the community, who gave me sort of endless examples and inputs and opportunities to shadow and observe. So that's sort of how I built my confidence and skills.
Beautiful. Thank you for sharing that. It was also ChatGPT that said that we learn how to facilitate through community. I think it's so important to have the safe space where we can just play and test.
Yeah. No, and that's exactly, I don't want to be down on the training program that I did, but I think I learned more about facilitation through the community than I did sitting in the classroom.
Of course. Which doesn't say anything about the training or teaching. I think that's just in the nature of things and everything that we have discussed until now, right?
Yeah. Well, thank you for giving me so much of your time. As ever, it's always a delight to ponder rich questions with you. I'm going to go through my list that I've made and see whether I can write a note about how do you teach presence for our students. And if I come up with anything useful, I'll be happy to share it with you.
This would be wonderful. Thank you so much for coming back and for this thought-provoking conversation, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for staying tuned and for listening to the show. I know how busy you are, and I appreciate that you're sharing your two most valuable resources with me and my guest, your time and your attention. If you're looking for more conversation with other facilitators and for a community of practice, why don't you join Never Done Before, the community that I have built, and many of my podcast guests are already members. Visit neverdonebefore.org, and I wish to see you there.